Hello, my name is Kriston McIntosh, and I would like to begin by thanking Prudential and D-Free for inviting me to be part of today's forum. I'd like to share some reflections on the racial wealth gap that persists in our nation. And I'll begin by offering a definition of wealth. Wealth can be defined as the difference between a household's assets and debt. And the examination of wealth is of particular importance because wealth confers benefits that go far beyond those associated with family or personal income. In fact, wealth holds several advantages over wages as an economic resource. For example, wealth allows people to take career risks, knowing that they'll have a buffer if success is not immediately achieved. Wealth affords people opportunities to become entrepreneurs and inventors. And family wealth enables young adults, even those who have just entered the workforce, to still access housing and safe neighborhoods with great schools, thereby enhancing the prospects for their own children. The income from wealth is taxed at much lower rates than income from work, which means that ultimately, wealth begets more wealth. And finally, wealth is a safety net that keeps a life from becoming derailed by temporary setbacks and the loss of income. The latter was particularly evident last year when the COVID-19 pandemic inflicted devastating effects on the United States economy, with job losses especially concentrated among women, minorities, and low-wage workers. And unfortunately, the Black-white wealth gap left many households with far fewer resources to weather that storm. The Black-white wealth gap is not a recent phenomenon. Rather, it's a continuation of centuries-long trends in wealth inequality within the United States. Efforts by Black Americans to build wealth can be traced back throughout American history. But unfortunately, these efforts have been impeded in a host of ways, beginning with 246 years of chattel slavery and followed by congressional mismanagement of the Freedmen's Savings Bank, which in 1874 left over 61,000 depositors with losses of nearly $3 million. There was the violent massacre decimating Tulsa's Greenwood district in 1921. And discriminatory policies continued throughout the 20th century, such as Jim Crow and the Black Codes, which strictly limited opportunity in many Southern states. The GI Bill, where Black veterans were prevented from accessing many of its housing provisions. The New Deal's Fair Labor Standards Act, which exempted domestic and agricultural service occupations, which at the time were widely held by many Black Americans. And of course, the practice of redlining within the mortgage and banking industry. Wealth was taken from these communities before it had the opportunity to grow. And this history matters for contemporary inequality because its legacy is passed down generation to generation through unequal monetary inheritances, which make up a great deal of current wealth. Just last year in 2020, Americans were projected to inherit about $765 billion in gifts and bequests, excluding wealth transfers to spouses, as well as transfers that support minor children. And much of this inherited income will go untaxed by the federal government. Wealth is the sum of resources available to a household at a point in time. And while it is clearly influenced by the income of a household, the two are not perfectly correlated. Two households can have the same income, but the household with fewer expenses or more accumulated wealth from past income or inheritances is going to have more wealth overall. And what's immediately evident is that the racial wealth gap remains, even for families with the same income. For those in the top 10% of income, just over 3.5% of Black earners, the racial wealth gap remains quite large. The median net worth for white families in this income group is over $1.7 million versus approximately $343,000 for Black families. In fact, a racial wealth gap exists in every income group except the bottom 20% of earners, where the median net worth is zero for just about everyone. So just how large and persistent are these racial wealth gaps? Well, the racial wealth gap remains even when we look within age groups. The typical young adult between the ages of 18 and 34 years old of either race has little wealth, but the gap rises quickly with age. Between the ages of 65 and 74 years old, $302,500 is the median wealth gap that's accumulated for white Americans versus just $46,000 in median Black wealth. So why are high and middle income white families so much wealthier than Black families with the same incomes? First of all, white families receive much larger inheritances on average than Black families do. And research has shown that inheritances and other intergenerational transfers of wealth account for more of the racial wealth gap than any other demographic or socioeconomic indicators. Black families who become high earners in particular years are also more likely than white families to drop out of the top earning level in subsequent years. So their respective wealth levels might reflect this difference. And finally, high and middle income Black families may be more likely than their white counterparts to be called upon to provide economic assistance to family members or neighbors. It's also important to recognize that the Black-white wealth gap can intersect with the gender wealth gap. And it's really important to note that these racial and gender wealth gaps and their intersection cannot simply be attributed to differences in household savings patterns or cash flow management challenges. Rather, they are the outcome of public policy decisions spanning centuries throughout US history. And this intersection of the racial and gender wealth gap is clearly illustrated by the following statistic. The median wealth of a single white man under the age of 35 is around $22,640. This figure is 3.5 times greater than that of single white women. It is over 14.5 times greater than that of single Black men. And it is over 224 times greater than that of single Black women. So this raises the question, what is the primary cause of the racial wealth gap? Well, there is no single, simple explanation for the racial wealth gap. The gap is not explained away by differences in educational attainment. Although we may hope that education is a great equalizer, college does not eliminate or even substantially reduce racial or ethnic wealth gaps. Unfortunately, Black families have median wealth that is less than white families with the same education. In fact, Black families with a bachelor's degree have much less wealth than white families with similar degrees. And Black families with bachelor's degrees even have less median wealth than the typical white family holding only high school diplomas. The wealth gap can also not be explained away by indebtedness, since white families actually tend to have higher levels of debt. Black families are less likely than white families to own various types of assets and often have lower valued assets when they do. For example, in 2019, 73% of white families compared to just 42% of Black families owned a home. In fact, Black families are only not just less likely to own a home, but their home ownership also yields lower levels of assets. In 2019, the typical white family's home value was approximately $230,000, compared with just $150,000 for Black families. So with fewer non-liquid assets to borrow against or to sell, the Black-white wealth gap is further exacerbated, leaving Black households particularly vulnerable to economic shocks, such as the loss of income that was experienced widely during the COVID-19 recession. Finally, we should look at what types of public policies can close the racial wealth gap. The solutions that the Black-white wealth gap and the policies that address racial inequity, they must be broad and bold. Reforming the rules surrounding inheritance or estate taxes in particular could enhance equality of opportunity, especially if those revenues were reinvested in programs that give low-income children a better chance at economic success. Also, avoiding the conflation of income with wealth will be imperative when designing public policies aimed at addressing the racial wealth gap. While a stronger safety net and additional income support can absolutely provide families with immediate protection against economic crises, it is unlikely to provide them with the long-term stability that can prepare them to weather future economic shocks in the same way that having access to wealth can. Indeed, closing the Black-white wealth gap will require that the deep and systemic economic disparities brought about by centuries of discriminatory policies are ultimately addressed through significant systemic and structural changes across a wide range of policy areas. Again, my name is Kriston McIntosh, and I thank you for your time today.